Imagine winning $62 million dollars and realizing your greatest danger wasn't strangers, but your own family. I am David Mercer, 58 years old. 3 weeks ago, 6 blinking numbers on a lottery ticket changed my life forever. $62 million. dollars. I sat at this very kitchen table, my hand trembling, my breath locked in my chest. And in that instant, even before the shock settled, one decision came to me like ice. No one in my family would ever know. Not Daniel, not Laura, not Stephen. Because in my family, money has never been love. Money has always been a chain. That might sound harsh, but you'll see why. This isn't a story about luck or fortune. It's about family betrayal, the kind that hides behind polite smiles and holiday dinners. It's about how toxic relatives can turn blessings into weapons, and how sometimes the people closest to you are the ones sharpening the knives. That night I didn't sleep. I sat under the dull kitchen lamp, staring at that ticket, the numbers glowing in my mind like a curse. $62 million. dollars. After taxes, maybe 40? Still more than I had ever dreamed of holding. And for a brief, fleeting moment, I wanted to celebrate. The boy I used to be, the boy from a cold Ohio farmhouse, wanted to shout to tell the world he was finally free. But the man I had become, scarred by toxic family dynamics, constant disappointments, and years of being drained, knew better. I poured a glass of bourbon even though my doctor warned me about blood pressure. The amber liquid caught the light as I swirled it, thinking about every time I had already been played for a fool. Daniel, my son, once begged for $5,000 just until the business takes off. I wired it before sunrise. He never mentioned it again. Laura, my daughter, leaned on me to help cover her condo closing costs. Promised it was temporary. 5 years later, she barely answers my calls. And Stephen, my younger brother, if there were a record for borrowed cash and broken promises, he'd win it. Always with that guilty tone, always making me feel responsible for his failures. So I sat there, bourbon burning down my throat, staring at the paper that could buy every house on this block. And I knew the truth. If I told them, they would circle me like vultures, each with their crisis, their urgent need, their carefully rehearsed lies. It wouldn't be a gift. It would be an obligation, not freedom, a leash around my neck. That's when another thought came to me, cold, steady, impossible to ignore. What if I tested them first? What if I turned the tables? Before I spent a single dollar, I needed to know the truth. If they thought I had nothing, who would stand by me, who would vanish, who would show their true face? This is not just a lottery story. This is a revenge story. This is the shocking truth of toxic bloodlines, inheritance drama, and dark family secrets. And once I pulled that thread, everything unraveled. People like to say family always comes first, that when storms hit, blood ties will carry you through. But that's not what happened to me. When my wife Grace was lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, when the bills piled higher than I could climb my own family. My children, my brother, found reasons to vanish. They had always been quick to appear when there was something to take, but when I was the one in need, their excuses were louder than their love. I think about Daniel first, my son. He always had an angle, always another business idea that needed cash before it could take off. He came to me 2 years ago, his voice low and urgent. Dad, I just need $5,000 just until the startup secures investors. I wired the money before sunrise. I told myself it was what fathers do, that maybe this time would be different. But the months rolled on, and Daniel never mentioned it again. He drove a new car, bragged about expansion plans, but the money I gave him had disappeared into the same black hole as all his other ventures. I had been his safety net so many times I lost count. But when Grace needed treatments not covered by insurance, when I asked if he could help even a little, his voice turned clipped. Dad, I can't keep bleeding money. The business is about to launch. He hung up before I could even explain. The words cut deeper than he knew. Laura was subtler. She always wrapped her needs in soft tones and promises. When she bought her first condo, she wanted me by her side, wanted my name on the paperwork, wanted me to cover what she couldn't. She swore it was temporary. She said she and her husband would pay me back within months. 5 years later, she barely answers my calls. And when I asked for help during Grace's illness, Laura's voice was gentle, but her refusal was final. Dad, Paul and I are paying off the condo. Maybe in a few months we could. The sentence drifted away like smoke, meaningless, empty. My brother Stephen was the worst of them all. If there were a world record for borrowed cash and broken promises, Stephen would have taken the crown. He always had that wheedling tone, that way of making me feel guilty for having a little more than him, even when all I had was a modest pension and a steady job. I loaned him money for rent, for car repairs, for debts he swore weren't his fault. Each time he swore it would be different, that he'd pay me back. He never did. When I asked him for help with Grace's treatments, his sigh was heavy with annoyance. "I've got my debts, David. Maybe you should refinance the house." That's what people do. As if selling the home Grace and I had built together was as casual as pawning a piece of furniture. That night I sat at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. My children had turned away. My brother dismissed me like I was a nuisance. The only person who stood by me was Aunt Clara, my father's sister, long retired and living off a pension that barely covered groceries. She came to see Grace, her hands trembling as she reached into her purse. She pressed a check for $200 into my palm. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "I wish it were more, David." That moment broke me more than all the refusals combined. She was the one with the least to give, and yet she gave without hesitation. No lectures, no excuses. Just love. And it hit me like a knife. The poorest member of my family was the richest in loyalty. The irony was unbearable. I told her it was enough, that her kindness meant more than money ever could, but the shame of needing her and the gratitude of receiving it burned together inside me. It stayed with me long after Grace passed. I looked at Daniel, Laura, and Stephen differently after that. Their excuses echoed in my head every time they smiled, every time they pretended we were still close. That was the night I stopped believing family would save me. That was the night I realized love in my family had always been a transaction. They say you can see the truth in someone's eyes if you look closely enough, but for years I refused to admit what mine were telling me. In public and gatherings, my family played their roles well. They wore masks of concern, masks of affection, masks of loyalty, but behind those masks I was never a father, never a brother. I was a wallet that breathed. I remember sitting across from Daniel one evening at a steakhouse. He had just finished bragging about a new partnership, his hands cutting the air with every word. He leaned forward, smiling wide, talking about future investments, about how the next big deal was just around the corner. He even toasted to my health, his glass clinking against mine. But while his words sparkled, I could see the calculation flicker in his eyes. To him, I wasn't just dad. I was a potential investor, another lifeline to keep his fragile empire afloat. I nodded, I smiled, I even pretended to share his excitement. But inside I knew. I wasn't being celebrated. I was being sized up. Laura was no different, only her methods were softer. At a family brunch, she reached across the table, her voice low and careful, telling me I needed to slow down and take care of myself. She asked about my blood pressure, about whether I had seen the doctor lately. Her face carried all the right expressions, her hand even squeezed mine like a daughter should. But when the conversation shifted to her condo renovations, the warmth in her voice turned into something sharper. She slipped in complaints about rising costs, about how expensive life had become, about how hard it was for young families to keep up. It wasn't a confession, it was bait. Her concern for me was a performance, a prelude to reminding me of her needs. I heard it clearly, even if she didn't say the words out loud. Then there was Stephen and his wife Patricia. Of all of them, they were the most polished in their act. At family gatherings, they would sit across from me with smiles that looked generous but never touched their eyes. Patricia, in particular, had a way of lacing her compliments with barbs. "David, it's incredible how you've managed to stay in that little house all these years, reliable as always. Not many people can live so modestly." Her laugh was sweet enough, but the glint in her eye told the truth. To her, I wasn't admirable. I was predictable. I was safe, and safe people make easy targets. Stephen would add his own chorus, patting my back, telling me how lucky I was to be so steady. But beneath it, I felt their shared thought: as long as David is steady, he will keep carrying us. They dressed their greed in smiles, wrapped their intentions in holiday cheer, and I let them. Year after year, I convinced myself that maybe I was reading too much into it, that maybe I was imagining the weight behind their words. But I couldn't ignore the way their eyes shifted when the topic of money entered the room. Conversations about family vacations, about birthdays, about health, they all eventually curved back to finances. And each time I felt the walls close in. It hit me like a slow, cold truth. The laughter around those tables wasn't about love or belonging. It was about keeping me comfortable enough to keep giving. I was not a father they respected. I was not a brother they cherished. I was a resource they expected to never run dry. Their words, their smiles, their feigned concern, it was all part of the same theater. And somewhere deep down, I realized I was the only one who hadn't been acting. There are nights when silence feels heavier than words, when the house itself seems to breathe with memories you can't outrun. I sit in this old living room, the wallpaper faded, the floor creaking under my weight, and I can still hear her. Grace's laughter used to fill this space, mixing with the sound of pots clattering in the kitchen and the footsteps of two children running down the hall. Back then it was a home. Now it is a mausoleum echoing with voices that belong only to the past. On the table in front of me lies a leather notebook worn smooth from years of being opened and closed its pages, carrying fragments of my life. I stared at it for hours that night, tracing my fingers over the cover, as if waiting for it to speak. But the only voice that rose up was my own memory, every moment I had given, every moment they had turned their backs. Daniel's late-night call asking for money, Laura's quiet manipulations, Stephen's endless pleas. I had carried them all, and in return, when I needed something as simple as compassion, they vanished. It wasn't just the money, it was the silence that followed. Silence on the other end of the phone when I mentioned hospital bills. Silence when I asked for help covering prescriptions. Silence that told me louder than words that my value had run out. As I sat in the dim light, my mind replayed those nights with Grace. She never asked for much, never complained, even when the pain took her voice. I remembered holding her hand, feeling her bones sharper than they had ever been, promising her I'd keep going no matter what. Yet even then I was already alone. My children had excuses, my brother had debts, and I was drowning while they stood safely on the shore. That memory pressed down on me until I opened the notebook and wrote one question in bold letters across the first page. If they thought I was broke, who would still stand with me? The words stared back at me, almost accusing. For years I had been the giver, the dependable one, the man who fixed problems without complaint. But what if I became the problem? What if the man who never asked for help suddenly needed it? I imagined their faces. Daniel calculating the cost. Laura hesitating with sympathy wrapped around refusal. Stephen smirking, ready to tell me to refinance the house. Patricia whispering to others that I had finally slipped. And Clara, sweet Clara. I knew she would reach into her purse even if it meant going hungry. That thought both comforted and cut me. The poorest of them all was the only one I trusted to show up. The irony twisted inside me, sharp and bitter. I sat for a long time in that chair, the notebook open, the candle flickering, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. And in that silence I realized something I had been avoiding for years. Love in this family had never been free. It had always been measured, weighed, and traded. The truth I had buried under layers of denial was finally standing in front of me, undeniable. If I wanted to know once and for all who they were, I had to become the opposite of who I had always been. I had to stop carrying them. I had to let them decide whether they would carry me. Frank Dawson had been a cop for 30 years before retiring, and he carried with him a kind of wisdom that only comes from seeing the worst of people up close. When I confided in him about the lottery ticket, about my fears of what my family would do if they knew, he didn't laugh, he didn't dismiss me. He leaned across the table, his weathered hands folded, and said, "If you really want to know who they are, test them. Don't tell them about the winnings. Tell them you're broke. Watch what they do." The simplicity of it was brutal. It scared me more than the lottery numbers themselves. But I knew he was right. For years I had been the one carrying them. And if I ever wanted to know the truth, I had to let them think I had fallen. That night I sat at the kitchen table with my leather notebook open, a pen in hand, and wrote down each name. Daniel, Laura, Stephen, Patricia, even Clara. I left space beneath each name to record their answers. My chest was tight as I rehearsed the story in my head. I had lost money in bad investments the bank was circling. I needed $7,000 to keep the house. It wasn't an impossible number. It wasn't charity. It was a fair test. The next morning I started with Laura. My daughter answered brightly, her voice full of rehearsed warmth. When I explained my situation, there was a pause just long enough to feel like a knife. Then she spoke with sympathy wrapped in silk. "Oh, Dad, that's awful. But 7,000 is a lot. Paul just paid the kids' tuition, and we're still catching up on condo renovations. Maybe in a couple of months." Her voice drifted off. I cut in telling her the bank wouldn't wait. She hesitated again, then promised to talk to Paul about a smaller amount. I wrote in my notebook, "Sympathy excuses, no commitment." The bitterness lingered in my mouth as I dialed Daniel next. My son answered in his usual rushed tone, already annoyed before I finished the first sentence. When I told him I needed 7,000, he actually laughed a short, sharp sound. "Dad, you should have known better. Bad planning at your age. Come on, I can't just hand over money like that. You'll figure it out. You always do." Then, as if twisting the knife, he added, "Maybe you should consider assisted living. At least you'd be safe there." I gripped the phone tighter, swallowing the anger rising in my throat. I wrote in the notebook, "Dismissive lecture's refusal." My hand shook as I set the pen down. Then I called Stephen. My brother answered with his usual fake cheer, his voice dripping with charm. But the moment I explained, he shifted. 7 grand. "Hell, I don't even have 700. Times are tough, you know. Maybe you should sell the house. I'd be willing to take it off your hands before the bank does. Get you some quick cash." His words hit me like a slap. He wasn't just refusing, he was circling like a vulture. I wrote, "No help, predatory offer." Patricia didn't even wait for me to finish when I told her the story later that evening. Her laugh was sharp, cruel. "I always wondered when you'd finally slip up, David. You've been so self-righteous for so long. Now look at you." She suggested I downsize live within my means, as though the years I had spent bailing out her husband didn't count for anything. I wrote scorn judgment, no help. My hand was heavy by then, the page nearly filled with their betrayals. Finally, with dread in my chest, I dialed Clara. Part of me wanted to spare her, but fairness demanded she be included. When I told her the story, she didn't hesitate, not for a second. "Oh, David, that's terrible. I don't have 7, but I can get 3. It's nearly all my savings, but you need it more." Her voice cracked, but her resolve was steady. I couldn't hold back the tears as I wrote in the notebook. "True. Gave almost all she had. No hesitation." In that moment, the contrast was unbearable. The richest in money had given me nothing. The poorest in the family had given me everything. And with that, the truth was undeniable. The storm came early that evening, rain lashing against the windows, thunder rolling low like a warning. I had set the living room hours before polishing the table, arranging the chairs, making sure everything looked ordinary. But inside, I knew tonight would be anything but ordinary. By 6 o'clock, headlights cut across the driveway, one after another. My children, my brother, my sister-in-law, all stepping into this house as though it still belonged to them. The smell of wet coats and damp shoes filled the room as they settled, each carrying their own agenda. Stephen came first, swaggering in with a leather folder tucked under his arm. He didn't bother hiding his eagerness. He laid the papers on the table, tapping them like a gambler showing his hand. "Here it is, David. Clean cash deal. Sign and you walk away free." His voice was smooth, but his eyes gleamed with hunger. Daniel arrived next, jaw tight, his phone still glowing in his hand, as if I had interrupted something more important. He barely greeted me before turning his attention to the folder. "Dad, don't be a fool. Don't sign with him. Put the deed under my name. At least then it stays in the family. I'll take care of everything." His tone was sharp, commanding not the voice of a son, but of a man who believed he was entitled. Then Laura slipped in softer than the rest. Her eyes darted nervously around the room, her voice trembling. "Please, can we not fight Dad? Whatever happens, we just want you to be safe." She clasped her hands as though praying for peace, but her words felt like paper over fire, too thin to stop the blaze. The arguments started quickly, voices rising like knives drawn from their sheaths. Stephen slammed the papers on the table, insisting I had no better option. Daniel barked back, accusing him of trying to gut me alive. Laura tried to interject, her pleas drowned out as the two men shouted over her. The living room, once filled with family dinners and laughter, now echoed with the sound of betrayal, every word sharper than the rain outside. I sat still in my chair, hands folded, my face calm. I let them circle, let them reveal themselves in their desperation. Then when the noise reached its peak, I reached into my pocket and placed a small black recorder on the table. The red light blinked once before I pressed stop. The silence that followed was deafening. Every word I said evenly, my voice cutting through the storm and their panic. Every excuse, already recorded. For a moment, no one moved. Stephen's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a man drowning. Daniel froze his phone, slipping slightly in his grip. Laura's eyes widened, tears threatening at the corners. The rain hammered harder against the windows, the house itself seeming to lean in on their shame. The living room wasn't a home anymore. It was a mirror, a stage where every mask they had worn for years had slipped, and now there was no hiding what lay beneath. They saw it, and so did I. The greedy brother, the entitled son, the daughter who couldn't choose between loyalty and convenience. Their reflections stared back at them from my eyes, undeniable, unshakable. This house, I continued, my voice low but steady, is not just wood and nails. It is a witness. Tonight it showed me who you really are. The storm outside roared, but the storm inside had already broken. The silence after the recorder clicked off was heavy enough to crush the air from the room. They were stunned, caught in the glare of their own words, but I knew that wasn't the final blow. I had been holding back one last truth, the kind that would strip away every excuse they might try to cling to. Slowly, I pushed back my chair and stood. The storm outside rattled the windows, thunder rolling like a drumbeat beneath my feet. I walked to the old cabinet in the corner, opened the drawer, and pulled out a plain envelope. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. I turned back toward them, their eyes following me, anxious, suspicious, afraid. And then I said it. 3 weeks ago, I won $62 million. The words fell like stones into a still pond, sending ripples through their faces. Daniel blinked first. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, as his mind scrambled for footing. Dad, if that's true, then this changes everything. You can't handle that kind of money on your own. You need someone to manage it. Let me help you. I know investments. I can make sure you don't lose it. His voice cracked with panic, his polished confidence crumbling into naked desperation. Stephen leaned forward instantly, his eyes lighting up, like a man seeing prey within reach. David, listen to me. I've been in business my whole life. I can double it for you in 5 years, maybe less. Trust me, this is what I do. His hand slapped the table. His eagerness barely contained a salesman closing in on his mark. And then there was Laura. Her eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her face. She cried, but even in her sobs, there was hesitation. Dad, I don't know what to say. I want to be here for you, I really do. But 62 million, it's overwhelming. We need time to think, to figure this out. Her words broke in half part, grief part calculation, her love shackled by her own uncertainty. I looked at them, my son, my brother, my daughter, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. I felt clarity. Their faces told me everything. Daniel's greed wrapped in false concern. Stephen's hunger barely disguised as opportunity. Laura's tears, real but powerless, chained by indecision. And in that moment, I delivered the verdict. I set the envelope on the table with deliberate calm, met their eyes one by one, and said, you failed both tests when I had nothing and when I had everything. The storm outside howled, but the storm inside was already settled. Their shoulders sagged, their eyes darted, searching for words that would not come. The truth was carved into the air, undeniable, final. Daniel's mouth worked soundlessly before he sank back pale. Stephen's jaw tightened, fury flashing, as he realized the prize had slipped through his fingers. Laura wept softly, but even her tears could not wash away the stain of hesitation. The house, once a home, had become a courtroom, and the sentence had already been passed. When the storm of that night passed, I knew there was no going back. You can't unsee a mask once it's fallen. You can't unknow the truth once it's spoken. The very next morning, I met with my lawyer. I sat in his office, the papers spread out before me, like a final act of judgment. The decision wasn't complicated anymore. It was clean, simple, absolute. I cut every one of them out of my will. Daniel, Laura, Stephen, Patricia, their names erased with the stroke of a pen. No explanations, no second chances. In their place, I redirected everything. The 62 million, the house, the future I had once imagined for them, it would all flow somewhere else. a foundation for scholarships, because I knew what it was like to be told you couldn't afford an education. A wing in the local hospital stamped with Grace's name because she had deserved better than the care I could barely afford. A shelter downtown for families who had no one to turn to because I knew the sting of being abandoned by your own blood. If my family couldn't carry my legacy, strangers would. And maybe that was the truest form of family, after all, choosing where your love goes instead of letting it be taken. When the documents were signed, I felt a weight lift from my chest, the kind of release you don't even realize you've been waiting for. But the silence that followed was short-lived. My phone began to buzz relentlessly. First came the pleading messages. Laura, her words dripping with remorse, promising she hadn't meant to hesitate, that she'd do better, that she loved me. Then came Daniel, furious one moment, begging the next. Dad, don't do this. You're overreacting. I can handle the money. Don't throw it away. And Stephen, oh Stephen, his messages were the ugliest. Accusations that I had betrayed him, curses that I had been selfish all along, threats that meant nothing now that he had no leverage. Message after message, call after call, the screen filled with their desperation, but I never replied. Silence became my answer. At first, the quiet felt strange, unnatural. For decades, I had been the one who smoothed things over, who softened blows, who offered comfort even when I was the one bleeding. Now I gave them nothing, not even the dignity of a response. Days passed, then weeks. Their voices faded into background noise I refused to hear. And in that silence, something remarkable began to grow inside me. Freedom. One evening, I sat on the porch as the sun slid low, painting the world in amber. The air smelled of cut grass, the breeze gentle after the storm. Frank Dawson sat beside me, sipping his black coffee, the way he always did, his eyes steady on mine. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. You finally look free. His words landed heavier than I expected, but in the best way. I didn't need to think about my answer. Because I am, I told him. And for the first time in years, I wasn't lying, not to him, not to myself. The house is quiet now. No raised voices, no arguments echoing through the walls, no footsteps of people who once called themselves family, but only came to collect. Just silence, the kind of silence that no longer feels like punishment, but peace. I sit in the old armchair by the window, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands, and I let myself breathe. For the first time in years, I don't feel the weight of their demands pressing down on me. I don't feel the leash of obligation tugging at my throat. I am alone, yes, but alone on my own terms. I lost my faith in blood ties, but I gained something greater. My dignity, my freedom, and the memories of Grace, the only person who ever loved me, without asking for anything in return. I look around the room at the photographs still hanging on the walls, at the faint smell of coffee and old wood that has become my companion. This house is no longer a trap. It is no longer a stage for their greed. It is a sanctuary, and it belongs to me, not because of the deed, not because of the money, but because I chose to protect it, and in doing so, protect myself. I whisper the words out loud, letting them settle in the quiet air. Family betrayal destroys trust, but revenge and the truth restores dignity. They aren't just words, they are the verdict. The answer to every sleepless night, every doubt, every wound I carried for too long. The truth didn't just expose them, it freed me. And the revenge wasn't money or power, it was clarity. The kind of clarity that makes you stand taller, breathe deeper, and finally feel alive again. So if you've ever felt used, if you've ever questioned whether love in your family was real or just a transaction, remember this: you don't need their approval to reclaim your worth. You don't need their validation to stand tall. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger, but peace. And the sharpest weapon is the truth. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone's true face when money, trust, or loyalty was on the line? Share your thoughts in the comments, I'll be reading them. And if this story struck a chord with you, save this video so you can return to it whenever you need strength, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that dig beneath the surface of what family really means. Because in the end, the truth doesn't just set us free, it keeps us alive.